James Coleman sat in his secluded cabin on the edge of a snow-covered forest, the howling wind outside shaking the windows and drowning the silence of his solitary life. The small fire in his hearth painted the room with dim, flickering light, a far cry from the warmth that once filled his home when his wife, Caroline, was alive. Her absence haunted him, her laughter now a memory that echoed through empty hallways. Winter, a season she had loved for its quiet beauty, now seemed nothing but a cruel, icy void. The cabin, nestled in the outskirts of Whitefish, Montana, had been their shared dream. James and Caroline had stumbled upon it during a summer road trip 5 years ago, falling in love with its rustic charm and the promise of peaceful retirement. They'd spent the next few years fixing it up, turning the worn-down structure into a cozy haven. Now, barely a year after Caroline's passing, James found himself alone in the home they'd built together. He took a sip from the lukewarm coffee mug clutched in his hands, grimacing at the bitter taste. The clock on the mantel ticked away, each second feeling like an eternity. James's eyes wandered to the framed photo of Caroline, her smile radiant as she stood in front of their newly purchased cabin. The memory of that day felt like a lifetime ago. A gust of wind rattled the windows, drawing James's attention back to the present. He stood up, joints creaking in protest, and made his way to the fireplace. As he added another log to the dying embers, a flash of movement outside caught his eye. He squinted, trying to make out shapes in the swirling snow, but saw nothing. Shaking his head, James returned to his chair, pulling the worn quilt tighter around his shoulders. He reached for the dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird on the side table, Caroline's favorite book. They used to read it aloud to each other on nights like this, finding comfort in the familiar words and each other's company. Now, the pages felt cold and lifeless under his fingers. The sharp sound of scratching against the porch snapped James from his reverie. His brows furrowed, and he hesitated briefly, unsure whether to investigate. But something, perhaps an instinct buried deep beneath his grief, forced him to his feet. Wrapping himself in a thick coat, he opened the front door, and what he saw made his chest tighten. A golden retriever lay curled on his porch, her fur dusted with snow, shivering violently. Nestled against her stomach, almost invisible beneath her protective frame, was a tiny puppy barely clinging to life. The sight stirred something in James, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months, concern for something other than his own pain. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. The mother dog raised her head weakly, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. James knelt beside them, his movements careful, his voice a soft murmur as he reassured the mother dog. She looked up at him with pleading eyes, her breaths labored, her body trembling from cold and exhaustion. Without hesitation, James scooped up both animals and carried them inside, gently placing them before the fire. As the warmth began to seep into their bones, James worked quickly, wrapping the puppy in an old blanket and preparing some water and food for the mother. For the first time in months, his heart stirred with a sense of urgency and purpose. He rummaged through the kitchen cupboards, finding an old bowl that he filled with water. Kneeling beside the mother dog, he held the bowl to her muzzle, encouraging her to drink. She lapped at the water gratefully, her eyes never leaving James's face. "That's it, girl," he murmured, stroking her head gently. "You're safe now." As the mother dog drank, James turned his attention to the puppy. It was so small, barely bigger than his hand. He carefully unwrapped it from the blanket, checking for any visible injuries. The puppy whimpered softly, its tiny body shivering despite the warmth of the fire. James's mind raced, trying to remember what he knew about caring for newborn puppies. He and Caroline had always talked about getting a dog, but they'd never gotten around to it. Now, faced with this unexpected responsibility, he felt woefully unprepared. Still, as he looked at the two vulnerable creatures before him, James felt a spark of determination. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he couldn't turn them away. They needed him, and in a way he couldn't quite articulate, he needed them too. He spent the next few hours moving between the mother and puppy, offering water and warmth, and doing his best to make them comfortable. As the night wore on, James found himself talking to them, his voice low and soothing. "You picked a hell of a night for a visit," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. It felt strange, that smile, like muscles long unused suddenly remembering their purpose. But I'm glad you found your way here. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered landscape in soft pinks and golds, James realized he'd been up all night. The mother dog was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and strong. The puppy, too, seemed more lively, squirming in its blanket and making tiny mewling sounds. James stood by the window, watching the sunrise. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of something that might have been hope. He turned back to look at the sleeping dogs, and in that moment, he made a decision. These unexpected visitors weren't just passing through, they were home. "Looks like we're in this together," he said softly, more to himself than to the sleeping animals. As he spoke the words aloud, James felt something shift inside him. The oppressive silence of the cabin, which had been his constant companion for so long, seemed to lift a little. He made his way to the kitchen, intent on making a proper breakfast, not just for himself, but for his new charges as well. As he moved about the small space, he found himself humming softly, a tune Caroline used to sing while she cooked. The sound of his own voice, the warmth of the fire, and the presence of the two sleeping animals filled the cabin with a sense of life that had been missing for far too long. James knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Caring for a mother dog and her newborn puppy would be a challenge, especially given his own emotional state. But as he cracked eggs into a bowl and heated up a pan, James felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him since Caroline's passing. These animals needed him, and in helping them, he might just find a way to help himself. As the smell of cooking eggs filled the cabin, James heard a soft whine from the living room. The mother dog was awake, her eyes following his movements. James smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Breakfast will be ready soon," he said, surprised at how natural it felt to be talking to someone, or something, again. "And then we'll figure out what comes next, together." The arrival of these unexpected guests on a frozen winter night had done more than just break the monotony of James's solitary existence. It had cracked open a door he'd thought was permanently closed, letting in a sliver of light and hope. As he finished preparing breakfast, James felt, for the first time in a long while, that he might be ready to step through that door and face whatever lay on the other side. As the morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, James found himself in an unfamiliar routine. The golden retriever rested her head on her front paws, her eyes never leaving James as he moved around the cabin. She seemed to sense his cautious kindness, though her exhaustion was evident. James, for his part, found himself speaking to her as if she understood every word. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" he murmured, crouching near her. "You're a fighter." He set down a bowl of warm water and some leftover chicken he'd found in the fridge. The dog sniffed at the offerings, her tail giving a tentative wag. James smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in months. "That's it, girl. You need to keep up your strength," he encouraged. As she ate, James turned his attention to the puppy. The tiny creature was still wrapped in the blanket, making small whimpering noises. James gently picked it up, cradling it against his chest. He could feel its rapid heartbeat, a reminder of how fragile this new life was. "Hey there, little one," he whispered. "You're quite the fighter too, aren't you?" Over the next few days, James fell into a new rhythm. His world, which had shrunk to the confines of his grief, suddenly expanded to include these two unexpected guests. He found himself researching online about caring for dogs and puppies, ordering supplies from the small general store in town, and even reaching out to the local vet for advice. The mother dog's unwavering resilience and gentle spirit became a constant source of amazement for James. Her devotion to her fragile puppy was clear. She rarely left his side except to eat or drink when James cooked her to. It was during one of these moments, as the puppy opened his eyes for the first time, that James was struck by the idea of names. He looked at the mother, her golden fur glinting in the firelight, and said aloud, "Grace. That's what you'll be. Because you've shown such grace in the face of adversity." The dog's ears perked up at the sound of her new name, and James could have sworn he saw a spark of recognition in her eyes. "And this little one." He paused, running a finger over the puppy's small head. "Chance. Because that's what you both have, a second chance." The puppy yawned widely, showing off a pink tongue, and James chuckled. "And I guess that's what you've given me too, huh?" Grace seemed to respond, her tail giving a slight wag as if in approval. James felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest, a faint crack in the ice that had encased his heart since Caroline's passing. Taking care of Grace and Chance not only filled the long, empty hours but brought a flicker of joy back into his life. Perhaps, he mused, in saving them, they were saving him too. As the days passed, James found himself opening up to his new companions in a way he hadn't been able to with anyone else since Caroline's death. He would talk to them as he went about his daily tasks, sharing memories of his life with Caroline, his fears, and even his hopes for the future. "You know, Grace," he said one evening as he sat by the fire, the dog's head resting on his knee, "Caroline would have loved you both. She always wanted a dog, but we never got around to it. Too busy with work, we said. Always thought we'd have time later." He sighed, absently stroking Grace's soft fur. "I guess that's the thing about time, huh? You never know how much you have until it's gone." Chance, who had been dozing in a makeshift bed nearby, stirred at the sound of James's voice. The puppy had grown stronger over the past week, his eyes now open and alert, taking in the world around him with curiosity. James reached over and gently scooped up Chance, holding him close. "But you too, you've given me a reason to look forward again. To think about tomorrow instead of just getting through today." As if in response, Chance let out a tiny yap, his tail wagging furiously. James laughed, a sound that surprised him with its genuine warmth. "Yeah, you're right, buddy. No use dwelling on what might have been. We've got to focus on what is, right?" The cabin, which had felt like a mausoleum to James's grief for so long, began to feel like a home again. The sound of Grace's nails clicking on the hardwood floors, Chance's excited yips, and James's own voice, growing stronger and more confident each day, filled the space with life. James started taking short walks with Grace, bundling up against the cold and venturing out into the snow-covered forest. At first, these excursions were brief, just long enough for Grace to do her business and get some fresh air. But as the days went by, they began to linger longer, James rediscovering the beauty of the winter landscape through Grace's eyes. One particularly crisp morning, as they stood at the edge of the tree line, James found himself describing the scene to Grace. "See those pine trees, girl? The way the snow sits on the branches? Caroline used to say it looked like someone had decorated them with powdered sugar." He chuckled at the memory. She always saw the beauty in things, even in the depths of winter. Grace looked up at him, her brown eyes seeming to understand. She nuzzled his hand, her cold nose a gentle reminder of her presence. "Yeah, I know," James said softly. "I'm lucky to have you here to remind me of that beauty too." Back at the cabin, Chance was growing more adventurous by the day. James had set up a small pen in the living room, giving the puppy a safe space to explore. He would sit for hours, watching Chance wobble around on unsteady legs, marveling at the puppy's determination. "You know, Chance," James said one afternoon as he sat cross-legged in the pen, "you remind me a lot of your mom. That same fighting spirit." He reached out, letting Chance gnaw playfully on his fingers. "I guess that's fitting, given your name." As the weeks went by, James found himself smiling more, laughing at Grace's antics and Chance's clumsy attempts at play. He started calling his sister, Sarah, more often, sharing stories about the dogs and even making tentative plans for her to visit in the spring. "You wouldn't recognize the place, Sarah," he told her during one of their calls. "Or me, for that matter. These dogs, they've brought life back into this old cabin. And into me, I guess." Sarah's voice was warm with happiness when she replied, "Oh, James. You have no idea how good it is to hear you sound like yourself again. Those dogs are a blessing." "They really are," James agreed, watching as Grace gently nudged Chance away from chewing on a table leg. "I don't know where I'd be without them." One evening, as James sat on the porch watching the sun set, Grace by his side and Chance curled up in his lap, he found himself thinking about the future for the first time in months. He imagined the coming spring, teaching Chance to fetch, maybe planting a garden. He thought about the possibility of adopting more animals in need, of turning the cabin into a real home again. The thought didn't frighten him as it once might have. Instead, he felt a quiet excitement, a readiness to embrace what lay ahead. "What do you think, guys?" he asked, scratching behind Grace's ears and gently stroking Chance's back. "Ready for some new adventures?" Grace's tail thumped against the porch boards, and Chance let out a sleepy yawn. James laughed, feeling a sense of contentment settle over him. "Yeah, me too," he said softly. "Me too." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, James stood up, cradling Chance in one arm and patting his leg for Grace to follow. They headed inside, leaving the cold and darkness behind, stepping into the warmth and light of their shared home. James paused in the doorway, looking back at the night sky. He thought of Caroline, of the life they'd shared and the dreams they'd had. For the first time, the memory didn't bring only pain. There was sadness, yes, but also gratitude for the love they'd shared, and hope for the future he was building. "Thank you," he whispered, to Caroline, to the universe, to whatever twist of fate had brought Grace and Chance into his life. Then he closed the door, turning to face the warmth and love waiting for him inside. Finding Grace and naming Chance hadn't just given James 2 new companions. It had given him a new purpose, a reason to open his heart again. As he settled in for the night, Grace curled up at the foot of his bed and Chance snuggled in his special bed nearby. James felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. He drifted off to sleep with a smile on his face, looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. In Grace and Chance, he had found more than just pets. He had found family, hope, and a chance at a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, James Coleman was ready to embrace it all. As the storm outside persisted, James focused on nursing Grace and Chance back to health. The days blended into one another, marked by the rhythm of feeding times, short walks, and quiet moments by the fire. Grace's energy gradually returned, and soon she was able to stand and walk around with more confidence. She explored the cabin in cautious circles, her protective nature ever present as she kept a watchful eye on her pup. James found himself marveling at Grace's resilience. "You're something else, you know that," he'd often say to her as she padded around the living room. Her tail would wag in response, those soulful brown eyes looking up at him with what James swore was understanding. Chance, once too weak to even lift his head, began moving around clumsily on unsteady legs, his curiosity sparking life into the quiet cabin. His first wobbly steps across the living room floor had James grinning from ear to ear, pride swelling in his chest as if Chance were his own child taking his first steps. "Look at you go, little man," James cheered, clapping his hands softly as Chance tottered towards him. Grace watched from nearby, her tail thumping against the floor in what seemed like approval. James reveled in their progress. He started his mornings alongside them, feeding Grace a hearty meal and ensuring Chance received nourishment. The routine gave his days structure, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. He found himself talking to them constantly, sharing stories of his life with Caroline, and even recounting memories of the snow-filled winters they once embraced together. "You know, Grace," James said one morning as he sipped his coffee, watching the snow fall outside, "Caroline used to love days like this. She'd bundle up and drag me outside to build snowmen or make snow angels." He chuckled softly, the memory warming him more than the coffee. "I'd grumble about the cold, but she always knew how to make it fun." Grace would often rest her head on his knee as if listening, while Chance busied himself clambering over James's legs, his tiny paws leaving wet prints on James's jeans. The physical contact, the warmth of their bodies, the sound of their breathing, it all served to ground James, to remind him that he wasn't alone anymore. As the weeks passed, James found himself opening up more and more to his furry companions. He'd share his fears, his regrets, and even his hopes for the future. It was cathartic, speaking these thoughts aloud after keeping them bottled up for so long. "I wonder sometimes," he confided in Grace one evening as they sat by the fire, Chance snoozing in his lap, "if I'm doing right by Caroline's memory. She always wanted me to be happy, you know? But for a long time after she was gone, I couldn't imagine being happy without her." Grace looked up at him, her eyes seeming to hold a wisdom beyond words. She nuzzled his hand gently, and James felt a lump form in his throat. "But you too," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "you've reminded me that it's okay to find joy again. That it doesn't mean I've forgotten her or love her any less." Every evening, James marveled at how much brighter the tiny cabin seemed with Grace and Chance there. The silence that had once felt oppressive was now filled with the soft padding of paws, the jingle of collar tags, and the occasional bark or whine. It was a symphony of life that James hadn't realized he'd been missing. Grace, now stronger, began following James outside during his trips to gather firewood. At first, James was hesitant, worried about the cold affecting her. But Grace's determination won out, and soon it became their shared routine. She'd trot alongside him, her tail wagging despite the cold, occasionally stopping to sniff at interesting scents beneath the snow. "You're a real trooper, Grace," James would say, watching her navigate the snowy terrain with ease. "I bet you could teach me a thing or two about embracing the cold." Chance would wait by the door, whining softly until they returned, eager to pounce on James's boots and sniff at the scent of the outside world. His playful antics never failed to bring a smile to James's face, even on the coldest, darkest days. As Grace and Chance grew stronger, so did James. He found himself venturing out more, taking longer walks with Grace and even making trips into the nearby town of Whitefish for supplies. The shopkeepers, who had grown used to seeing James as a solitary, somber figure, remarked on the change in him. "You're looking well, James," Mrs. Thompson at the general store said one day as she rang up his purchases: dog food, puppy supplies, and a few treats for his new family members. "Those dogs of yours must be keeping you on your toes." James smiled, realizing it no longer felt forced or unnatural. "They certainly are, Martha. They've been a real blessing." The cold days of winter seemed to pass more quickly now. James found himself looking forward to each new day, eager to see what small milestones Grace and Chance might reach. He started a journal, jotting down their progress and his own thoughts. It was something Caroline had always encouraged him to do, but he'd never found the time or motivation before. Day 37 with Grace and Chance, he wrote one evening. "Chance managed to climb the entire length of the couch today without falling. His determination reminds me so much of Caroline." Grace watched the whole time, looking every bit the proud mama. "As for me, I realized I laughed more today than I have in months. These two, they're healing parts of me I thought were broken for good." The bond between James, Grace, and Chance continued to strengthen with each passing day. They developed their own little rituals: morning cuddles in bed, afternoon play sessions where James would roll a softball for Chance to chase while Grace supervised, and quiet evenings by the fire where James would read aloud from his favorite books. "I think you two might be fans of Steinbeck," James mused one night, closing Of Mice and Men after reading a few chapters. Grace's tail thumped against the floor, and Chance yawned widely, stretching out on his back. "I'll take that as a yes," James chuckled. As February rolled into March, the first hints of spring began to appear. The days grew longer, and the relentless cold began to ease its grip. James found himself looking forward to the changing seasons in a way he hadn't since Caroline's passing. "Soon enough, we'll be able to spend more time outside," he told Grace and Chance one morning as sunlight streamed through the windows. "There's a whole world out there for you to explore, Chance. And Grace, I bet you'll love the hiking trails around here." The thought of the future no longer filled James with dread. Instead, he felt a quiet excitement, a readiness to embrace whatever lay ahead. He knew there would still be difficult days, moments when the grief would hit him anew. But now, he had Grace's steady presence and Chance's exuberant energy to help him through those times. One particularly mild afternoon, James decided to take Grace and Chance for their first proper walk in the woods near the cabin. He bundled Chance up in a small coat he'd ordered online and made sure Grace's leash was secure. As they stepped out into the crisp air, James felt a sense of adventure he hadn't experienced in years. Grace walked confidently beside him, while Chance took in the sights and smells with wide-eyed wonder from the safety of James's arms. "This is it, guys," James said, his breath misting in the cool air. "This is the start of our new chapter together." As they made their way down the trail, the sound of their footsteps and paw steps crunching in the snow, James felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. These two beings, who had come into his life so unexpectedly, had brought with them a renewal he'd never thought possible. The cold days of winter had been a time of healing, of rediscovery, and of forging unbreakable bonds. As James watched Grace investigate a fallen log and felt Chance squirm excitedly in his arms, he knew that the warmth of spring wasn't just in the changing weather. It was in his heart, melting away the last of the ice that had encased it for so long. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to Grace and Chance, to the universe, or to Caroline's memory. Perhaps it was to all of them. "Thank you for this second chance." And as they continued their walk, venturing further into the awakening forest, James felt ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. With Grace and Chance by his side, he was no longer just surviving the cold days, he was truly living again, embracing each moment with a renewed sense of hope and joy. As March gave way to April, the landscape around James's cabin began to transform. The blanket of snow that had covered the ground for months slowly receded, revealing patches of brown earth and the first tender shoots of spring growth. The air carried the promise of warmer days to come, filled with the sweet scent of thawing earth and budding plants. James found himself spending more time outside with Grace and Chance, marveling at the changing world around them. Grace seemed to revel in the new smells and sights, her tail wagging constantly as she explored the awakening forest. Chance, now big enough to toddle along on his own for short distances, approached each new discovery with unbridled enthusiasm. "Easy there, buddy," James chuckled as Chance attempted to pounce on a surprised robin that had landed nearby. The bird fluttered away, leaving Chance to tumble in a pile of leftover leaves. "You've got to work on your stealth if you want to catch one of those." Grace watched her pup's antics with what James swore was an amused expression, her eyes darting between Chance and the surrounding area, ever vigilant. James had come to appreciate Grace's watchful nature, feeling a sense of security in her constant awareness. One particularly mild evening, as the sun began to dip below the tree line, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, James decided to enjoy the peaceful moment on the porch. He settled into his favorite rocking chair, a book in his lap and a mug of tea at his side. Grace lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws, while Chance dozed nearby, tuckered out from his latest exploration of the yard. As James sat with his book, he found his mind wandering, reflecting on the changes the past few months had brought. The grief that had once consumed him hadn't disappeared entirely, he knew it never would, but it had softened, become more manageable. In its place, a sense of contentment had begun to grow, nurtured by the unconditional love of his furry companions. "You know," he said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Grace's ears, "I never thought I'd feel this, at peace again. You two have been quite the miracle workers." Grace looked up at him, her brown eyes warm with affection. She gave his hand a gentle lick, as if to say, "We're in this together." The tranquil moment was suddenly shattered as Grace's demeanor changed in an instant. She stood, her ears pricked and her posture alert. A low growl rumbled in her chest, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the porch steps. James froze, instantly alert. It wasn't the wind this time, the sound of faint crunching footsteps reached his ears. His heart began to race, mind spinning with possibilities. They rarely had visitors out here, especially at this hour. "Grace," he whispered, slowly rising from his chair. "What is it, girl?" Grace's growl deepened, her body tense as she stared at the tree line. Chance, awakened by the commotion, whimpered softly and pressed himself against James's leg. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, James reached for the lantern he kept by the door. With trembling hands, he lit it, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the evening. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but the crunching sound grew closer. James's grip tightened on the lantern as he squinted into the shadows, trying to make out any movement. Suddenly, a shape emerged from the darkness. James's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the lean, predatory form of a coyote. Its eyes glinted in the lantern light, fixed hungrily on the porch, on Chance. Fear gripped James's heart. He had heard stories from neighbors about coyotes becoming bolder, venturing closer to homes in search of easy prey. But he had never expected to face one himself. Before James could react, Grace stepped in front of him, her body a shield between the threat and her family. Her growls grew louder and more menacing, hackles raised as she stared down the intruder. The coyote hesitated, its eyes flickering between Grace and the man behind her. For a tense moment, time seemed to stand still. James could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, feel Chance trembling against his leg. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the coyote slunk back into the shadows, apparently deciding that this potential meal wasn't worth the risk. When the danger passed, James knelt and stroked Grace's fur, his gratitude evident. "You're incredible," he whispered, eyes misty. "Thank you, girl. You protected us." Grace turned to him, her posture relaxing slightly, though she remained alert. She nuzzled James's hand, then turned to check on Chance, giving the puppy a reassuring lick. It was that protective act, James realized, that mirrored the long-departed love he had felt from Caroline. Grace was more than a survivor, she was a guardian, fiercely devoted to keeping her family safe. The incident left James shaken but filled with a newfound appreciation for Grace. As they headed back inside, he made sure to secure the door tightly, his mind already working on plans to better protect their home. That night, as James lay in bed with Grace curled up at his feet and Chance in his special bed nearby, he found himself reflecting on the events of the evening. The fear he had felt was real, but so was the sense of security that Grace's presence provided. "You know, Caroline," he whispered into the darkness, continuing the one-sided conversations he often had with his late wife, "I think you had a hand in bringing Grace and Chance to me. You always knew what I needed, even when I didn't." He reached down to pat Grace gently, smiling as she shifted in her sleep, pressing closer to him. "She reminds me of you in some ways. That unwavering loyalty, the way she looks out for us. It's like having a piece of you here with me." The next morning, James woke early, his mind still processing the previous night's events. He made his way to the kitchen, Grace and Chance following close behind, their normal morning routine a comforting constant after the excitement of the night before. As he prepared breakfast, kibble for Grace, a special puppy formula for Chance, and a strong cup of coffee for himself, James found himself watching Grace more closely. She moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, even in the safety of the cabin. "You're always on duty, aren't you?" James mused, setting down Grace's food bowl. She looked up at him, tail wagging, before diving into her breakfast. "I don't know how I got so lucky to have you watching over us." Over the next few days, James took steps to make their home more secure. He reinforced the fences around the yard, installed motion sensor lights, and even spoke to a local ranger about the best ways to deter wildlife from coming too close to the cabin. Through it all, Grace remained vigilant, her protective instincts seemingly heightened since the coyote incident. She would often position herself between Chance and any perceived threat, whether it was an unfamiliar sound from the woods or a car pulling up the driveway when James's sister came to visit. "I've never seen a dog so devoted," Sarah remarked during her visit, watching as Grace gently herded Chance away from a patch of mud he was eyeing mischievously. "She's like a furry guardian angel." James nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "She really is. I don't know where I'd be without her, without both of them, really." As spring fully took hold, bringing with it longer days and warmer temperatures, James found that his fear from the coyote encounter had faded. In its place was a deep sense of security and belonging. Grace's watchful instincts had not only kept them safe but had also shown James that it was okay to let his guard down, to allow himself to feel protected and cared for. One sunny afternoon, as James sat on the porch steps watching Grace and Chance play in the yard, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The world around him was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves, the air sweet with the scent of blooming wildflowers. "You've taught me so much," he said softly, catching Grace's attention. She trotted over, nuzzling his hand affectionately. "About strength, about loyalty, about what it means to truly look out for someone." Chance came bounding over as well, his gangly puppy legs still not quite coordinated. He collapsed in a heap at James's feet, panting happily. As James sat there, surrounded by the love and protection of his furry family, he felt truly at home for the first time in years. Grace's watchful instincts had not only kept them safe from external threats but had also guarded James's heart, allowing it to heal and open up to love again. The sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. James stood, brushing off his jeans. "Come on, you two," he said, a smile playing on his lips. "Let's head inside. Tomorrow's another day, and I can't wait to see what adventures it brings." Grace and Chance followed him into the cabin, their paws creating a comforting rhythm on the wooden floors. As James closed the door behind them, he felt grateful for the twist of fate that had brought these two into his life. With Grace's watchful instincts and Chance's joyful spirit, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. As the snow began to melt and the forest transitioned into spring, life in the cabin underwent its own transformation. Grace had become a vibrant and alert companion, while Chance had grown into a boisterous and curious little pup. The once fragile animals were now full of life, bringing energy and laughter back into the cabin. James spent hours outside with them, watching as they chased each other through the budding grass and sniffed at the first flowers of the season. The isolation he had once sought after Caroline's death no longer felt like a necessity. James began smiling more, the shadow of grief no longer weighing him down as heavily. The trio discovered a rhythm together, with Grace acting as the firm yet gentle leader, Chance as the spirited youth, and James as their unwavering caregiver. They went on long walks, forged paths through the woods, and found joy in the simple acts of existence. One crisp morning in early May, James woke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. He stretched, feeling more refreshed than he had in months. Grace, who had taken to sleeping at the foot of his bed, raised her head and gave a soft woof in greeting. "Morning, girl," James said, reaching out to scratch behind her ears. "Ready to start the day?" Grace's tail thumped against the bed in response. From his cozy bed in the corner, Chance let out a sleepy yawn, blinking awake at the sound of James's voice. As James went about his morning routine, he found himself humming a tune, something he hadn't done since Caroline passed. The realization made him pause, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't that he had forgotten Caroline or the pain of losing her, but rather that he had found a way to carry her memory with him while still embracing the present. After breakfast, James decided to take Grace and Chance on a longer walk than usual. The air was cool but not cold, filled with the promise of warmer days to come. As they set out, James noticed new growth everywhere he looked, tiny leaves unfurling on the trees, wildflowers pushing up through the earth, even a family of deer grazing in a nearby meadow. "Look at that, you too," James said softly, pointing out the deer to Grace and Chance. Grace watched attentively, her posture alert but calm. Chance, still learning the finer points of stealth, let out an excited yip, causing the deer to bound away into the forest. James couldn't help but laugh at Chance's enthusiasm. "Well, buddy, I guess we'll have to work on your hunting skills," he chuckled, ruffling the pup's fur. As they continued their walk, James found himself opening up to his furry companions, sharing thoughts and memories he had kept locked away for too long. "You know, Caroline and I always talked about planting a garden," he mused as they passed a sunny clearing. "She loved flowers, said they were nature's way of painting the world with joy." Grace looked up at him, her brown eyes seeming to encourage him to continue. Chance, for his part, was busy investigating a particularly interesting patch of grass. Maybe we could do that," James said, the idea taking root in his mind. A garden. Something beautiful to remember her by. The more he thought about it, the more excited James became. By the time they returned to the cabin, he was already making mental lists of what he'd need to get started. Over the next few weeks, James threw himself into the garden project with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. He ordered seeds and gardening tools online, pored over books about local flora, and even reached out to some of his neighbors for advice. Grace and Chance were constant companions throughout the process. Grace would often lie nearby as James worked the soil, her watchful gaze alternating between him and their surroundings. Chance, ever the helper, seemed to take great joy in digging holes, though not always where James intended them to be. "Chance, buddy, I appreciate the effort," James laughed one afternoon, gently redirecting the pup away from a freshly planted row of seeds. "But let's leave the digging to me, okay?" As May turned to June, the garden began to take shape. Rows of vegetables sprouted alongside beds of colorful wildflowers. James had chosen plants that were native to the area, creating a haven for local wildlife. Hummingbirds and butterflies became frequent visitors, much to Chance's delight. The garden became more than just a memorial to Caroline, it was a symbol of James's own renewal. Each plant he nurtured, each flower that bloomed, felt like a step forward in his healing process. One warm evening, as James sat on the porch admiring his handiwork, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. Grace lay at his feet, while Chance dozed in a patch of fading sunlight. "I think Caroline would have loved this," James said softly, more to himself than to the dogs. "She always said that life finds a way to go on, to bloom even after the harshest winter." As if in response, a gentle breeze rustled through the garden, carrying with it the sweet scent of blooming flowers. James closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at home. The transformation wasn't limited to the garden or even to James himself. Grace, once wary and protective to a fault, had begun to relax more. She still kept a watchful eye on her family, but there was a newfound playfulness to her demeanor. She would often initiate games of fetch with James or playful wrestling matches with Chance. Chance, for his part, was growing by leaps and bounds, both physically and in terms of his training. James had started teaching him basic commands, and the pup showed a keen intelligence that often left James shaking his head in amazement. "You're too smart for your own good, you know that," James would often say as Chance mastered yet another trick. The pup would respond with a happy bark, tail wagging furiously. As spring began to give way to summer, James found himself looking forward to each new day with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The isolation he had once sought after Caroline's death no longer felt like a necessity. Instead, he began to crave connection, not just with Grace and Chance, but with the world beyond their little haven. He started reaching out to old friends, rekindling relationships that had fallen by the wayside in the depths of his grief. He even began volunteering at the local animal shelter, sharing the knowledge he'd gained from caring for Grace and Chance. "You two have taught me so much," he told them one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "About love, about healing, about finding joy in the simple things." Grace rested her head on his knee, while Chance sprawled across his feet, both of them radiating contentment. James felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by the love he felt for these two beings who had come into his life so unexpectedly. "I don't know where I'd be without you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a second chance at life." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, James felt a sense of hope for the future that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The pain of losing Caroline would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it had become a part of his story, a chapter that had led him to this new beginning with Grace and Chance. The garden flourished, a vibrant testament to life's resilience. The cabin, once a refuge from the world, had become a home filled with warmth and love. And James, who had once thought his life was over, found himself excited for what each new day might bring. As he stood to head inside, Grace and Chance falling into step beside him, James paused for a moment. He looked out over the garden, then up at the star-filled sky. "Thank you," he whispered, to Caroline, to the universe, to whatever twist of fate had brought Grace and Chance into his life. Then he turned, ready to face whatever adventures tomorrow might bring, knowing he wouldn't be facing them alone. The springtime renewal had done more than just transform the landscape around them. It had renewed James's spirit, healed his heart, and given him a new lease on life. With Grace and Chance by his side, he was ready to embrace whatever the future held, one day at a time. As the weeks turned into months, James found himself embracing the life he had once thought ended with Caroline's passing. Grace and Chance were no longer just companions, they were family. Their bond had been forged in the harshness of winter and nurtured in the warmth of spring, an unbreakable connection born from shared trials and quiet victories. The cabin, once a solitary refuge, now bustled with life. The sound of paws padding across wooden floors, the jingle of collar tags, and the occasional playful bark filled the air. James's laughter, once a rare occurrence, became a regular part of their daily symphony. On a warm July morning, James sat on the porch, sipping his coffee and watching Grace and Chance play in the yard. Grace, ever the patient teacher, was showing Chance the finer points of fetch. The young dog's enthusiasm often outpaced his coordination, resulting in comical tumbles that never failed to bring a smile to James's face. "You're getting there, buddy," James called out encouragingly as Chance made another valiant attempt to catch the ball mid-air. The pup looked over at him, tail wagging furiously, before bounding off after the toy once more. As he watched them, James felt a familiar warmth in his chest, a feeling he now recognized as contentment. It wasn't the same as the happiness he'd known with Caroline, but it was real and deep and satisfying in its own way. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he mused aloud. Grace, hearing his voice, trotted over to rest her head on his knee. James scratched behind her ears, smiling at the contented sigh she let out. The garden he had planted in Caroline's memory was in full bloom, a riot of colors and scents that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. James had added a small bench among the flowers, a quiet spot where he could sit and reflect, feeling close to Caroline's memory while also appreciating the new life he had found. As summer progressed, James began making plans for the future. The idea came to him gradually, taking shape as he watched Grace gently guiding Chance, teaching him the ways of the world with infinite patience. "What do you think about expanding our little family?" he asked Grace one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Grace looked up at him, her brown eyes seeming to hold a wisdom beyond words. She gave a soft woof that James took as encouragement. The next day, James called the local animal shelter where he had been volunteering. "Hey, Sarah," he said when the manager answered. "I've been thinking. I might be ready to adopt another dog." Sarah's enthusiasm was palpable even through the phone. "Oh, James, that's wonderful. We've got a few dogs that I think would be perfect for you. Why don't you come by tomorrow and meet them?" The following afternoon, James found himself at the shelter, Grace by his side. They had decided to leave Chance at home for this first visit, not wanting to overwhelm any potential new family members. As they walked through the kennels, James felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. What if he couldn't connect with any of the dogs? What if Grace didn't get along with them? But his worries were soon put to rest. In the third kennel they visited, a small, scruffy terrier mix caught his eye. The dog was older, with a graying muzzle and calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the younger, more energetic dogs around him. "This is Max," Sarah said, noticing James's interest. "He's been with us for a while. Older dogs are often harder to place, but he's got a heart of gold." James knelt down, allowing Max to sniff his hand. The dog's tail gave a cautious wag, and he leaned into James's touch when he began to pet him. "Hey there, Max," James said softly. "What do you think about coming home with us?" Grace, who had been watching the interaction closely, stepped forward and gently nuzzled Maximum. The two dogs sniffed each other, tails wagging in a display of canine approval. James felt his heart swell. "I think we've found our new family member," he said to Sarah, unable to keep the smile off his face. The adoption process went smoothly, and before he knew it, James was driving home with Max in the backseat, Grace keeping a watchful eye on their new companion. Introducing Max to Chance was a moment James would never forget. The young dog's exuberance was tempered by Max's calm presence, and soon the three dogs were coexisting peacefully, each finding their place in the family dynamic. As summer faded into fall, James marveled at how much his life had changed in the span of a year. The cabin that had once felt too big and empty was now filled with love and life. The garden continued to thrive, and James had even started planning an expansion, thinking about adding a vegetable patch next spring. One crisp October morning, as James sipped his coffee on the porch, watching the leaves turn golden in the early light, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. Grace lay at his feet, Max curled up nearby, and Chance was exploring the yard, nose to the ground as he followed some intriguing scent. "You know," James said softly, more to himself than to the dogs, "I think this is what Caroline would have wanted for me. Not to forget her, but to find a way to live again, to find joy." As if in response, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. James closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. When he opened them again, he was surprised to feel tears on his cheeks, not tears of sadness, but of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, to Caroline, to Grace and Chance, to Max, to the universe that had brought them all into his life. The future stretched out before him, no longer a daunting emptiness but a path filled with possibilities. He thought about the plans he had started making, expanding the cabin to make room for more rescue animals, perhaps even starting a small sanctuary for older dogs like Max who had a harder time finding homes. As the days grew shorter and the nights cooler, James found himself looking forward to the coming winter. The season that had once filled him with dread now held the promise of cozy evenings by the fire, surrounded by his furry family. He thought about the holidays approaching, and for the first time in years, The idea filled him with anticipation rather than sorrow. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, James sat in his favorite armchair, a book open on his lap. Grace and Max dozed nearby, while Chance watched the falling snowflakes with fascination. James looked around the room, taking in the sight of his little family. The walls, once bare, were now covered with photos of Caroline, of the dogs, of the life they were building together. On the mantel sat a small urn containing Caroline's ashes, surrounded by fresh flowers from the garden. "I think you'd be proud," James said softly, his eyes on Caroline's photo. "It took me a while, but I finally understood what you always tried to tell me, that life is for living, that love multiplies rather than divides." As he spoke, Grace lifted her head, her eyes meeting James's. In that moment, he felt a connection that transcended words, an understanding that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The future stretched out before them, filled with promise. There would be challenges. Of course, life with 3 dogs was bound to have its ups and downs. But James knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white, James felt a sense of excitement for what lay ahead. The garden would sleep under its snowy blanket, ready to burst into life again in the spring. The holidays would come and go, bringing new traditions and memories. And through it all, Grace, Chance, and Max would be by his side, their love a constant reminder of the beauty and resilience of life. James closed his book and stood, stretching as he made his way to the window. He watched the snow fall, each flake a promise of renewal, of life continuing in its endless cycle. Behind him, he heard the soft sounds of the dogs stirring, ready for their evening walk despite the weather. With a smile, James turned from the window. "All right, gang," he said, reaching for their leashes. "Let's go make some paw prints in the snow." As they stepped out into the winter wonderland, James felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. The future was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace, full of grace and chance, and all the unexpected joys they would bring. The cabin door closed behind them, but the warmth of the home they had created together lingered, a beacon in the snowy night, promising comfort and love for whatever adventures lay ahead. James and his canine family set off into the gently falling snow, ready to write the next chapter of their story together.